Screaming agony, screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails, agony. Ain't no brand out cowboy. Ow, up yours, buster. Screaming agony. Ow, up yours, buster. Needles under fingernails. Ow, up yours, buster. Ow, up yours, buster. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. I'm here to say that. Needles under fingernails. Ain't no brand out cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Screaming agony. Ow, up yours, buster. Ain't no brand out cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails, agony. Needles under fingernails. Yours, buster. Needles under fingernails. Ow, up yours, buster. Ow, up yours. Agony. Ow, up yours, buster. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Ow, up yours, buster. Ow, up yours. Screaming agony. Ow, up yours. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Screaming agony. Ow, up yours, buster. Ow, up yours, buster. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Ow, up yours, screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Yours, buster. Needles under fingernails. Yours, buster. Yours, buster. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. fingernails under fingernails under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Enough, now, cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Under fingernails. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Cowboy, say that. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead. Now up yours, buster! Enough now, cowboy! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Enough now, cowboy! Up yours, buster! Screaming agony. Up yours! Enough now, cowboy! Needles under fingernails. Up yours, buster! Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Enough, Breno! Up yours! Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Enough, Breno, cowboy! Needles under fingernails. Up yours! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Up yours! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Up yours! Agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Enough, Breno, cowboy! Enough, Breno, cowboy! Screaming agony. Up yours! Up yours! Up yours! Up yours! Needles under fingernails. Up yours! Say that! Up yours! Screaming agony. Up yours! Screaming agony. Screaming Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Say that. Screaming agony. 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 Be not burn out, cowboy. Screaming agony. Come here and say that. Be not burn out, cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails. Agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Under fingernails. Under fingernails. Under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Come here and say that. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Ain't no burn out, cowboy. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Enough out, cowboy! Now up yours, buster! Unemployed dead people. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Now up yours, buster! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Now up yours! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. 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 Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Enough ran out, cowboy. Enough ran out, cowboy. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Cowboy. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. 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 Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Enough now, cowboy! Yours, Buster! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Yours, screaming agony. Yours, Buster! Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Yours, Buster! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Yours, Buster! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Yours, Buster! Unemployed dead people. Come here and say that! Needles under fingernails. 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 Under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Yours, Buster! Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Come here and say that! Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Yours, screaming agony. Enough now, cowboy! Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony, screaming agony, screaming agony. Unemployed dead. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony, screaming agony, screaming agony. Enough right now, cowboy. Unemployed dead. Enough right now, cowboy. Screaming agony. Enough right now, cowboy. Enough right now, cowboy. Enough right now, cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Enough right now, cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Say that. Enough right now, cowboy. Screaming agony, screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Enough right now, cowboy! Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Say that. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Enough right now, needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Enough right now, cowboy. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Under fingernails. Agony. Unemployed dead people. Say that. Say that. Say that. Unemployed dead people. Say that. Enough right now, cowboy. Unemployed dead people. Enough right now, cowboy. Needles under fingernails. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Say that. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Say that. Screaming agony. Needles under fingernails. Needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Needles under fingernails. Agony. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Fingernails, needles under fingernails. Unemployed dead people. Unemployed dead people. Unemployed dead people. Unemployed dead people. Unemployed dead, unemployed dead. Screaming agony. Screaming agony. Unemployed dead people.